Hello, YouTube divers. This is Water Dive 122, and I want to welcome you all to another episode of What's on the Turntable. Today, we are going to be talking about one of the most iconic rock bands of all time. We are going to be talking about the 4 albums from my dad's vinyl collection that belong to the band Van Halen. Now, I've talked about Van Halen once on this channel before when I did my Bands of the Alphabet video, and they showed up for my letter V spot. They are definitely one of the most successful and most influential late 70s rock bands to date. One of the most influential rock bands, period. Of course, Eddie Van Halen, one of the best guitar players of all time. Rest in peace, Eddie Van Halen. His brother, Alex, on the drums, David Lee Roth on vocals for these albums, and Michael Anthony on bass. So yeah, we're gonna review their first 4 albums here today, because those are the only albums we have to talk about here at this point. And so yeah, let's freaking get started. The self-titled debut album came out in 1978, and this album is a freaking stone cold classic. I adore this album. One of the best debut albums ever created. And that is saying something, because I usually tend to give debut albums a little bit of flack. For those of you who have been following my channel, you know that. And, newcomers, now you know. I usually tend to give debut albums a little bit of flack here, simply because, it's the debut album. The band is just trying to figure out where they want to go. They don't really have their signature sound yet, but there are several debut albums, like this one, that stands as a true soul exception. This was a band that before this album came out, no one was doing before. Like, there were no such thing as like these party rock bands and stuff. Like, the 70s were mainly like progressive rock and basically the birth of metal, like with Judas Priest and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, bands like that, and maybe Rush. And then you got the progressive rock genre with Yes, King Crimson, Pink Floyd, Genesis, aforementioned Rush, Gentle Giant, bands like that. And then Van Halen came along in the late 70s and absolutely blew everyone's minds. There are so many freaking classics on this thing, with Running with the Devil, which is my favorite Van Halen song. You Really Got Me, that killer cover. Jamie's Crying, Ice Cream Man, Eruption, one of the best instrumentals ever written. Ain't Talking About Love, Feel Your Love Tonight, On Fire. There's just so many great songs on here, and it's a stone cold classic for a reason. Definitely deserves the love and praise that it gets. So with that said, that's the debut album. Now let's move on to Van Halen 2. Van Halen 2 came out in 1979, and this album is a step down compared to its predecessor, but overall, this is still a very strong album with Dance the Night Away, Somebody Get Me a Doctor, which is my personal favorite off the album, Women in Love, DOA, Spanish Fly, Bottoms Up. There's a lot of great tracks on here. Of course, here's the back. I don't know if y'all can see that pretty clearly, but track listing, managements, and the band members' credits, record credits, and stuff like that are all listed here. I love the cover of this album. I love the logo on this album. I really like it. Now, this is something that has basically considered when holding this album and the debut album. I'll show it here. Put together. Yeah. So with the debut album, it feels like that Van Halen, because like I said when I was talking about this album, no one was doing what Van Halen was doing before this thing came out. you could tell that there was like some flashes of like the heavy rock stuff that Van Halen was known for. I mean, heck, on a lot of their classics. But on this album, in my opinion, Van Halen does it a little bit more better. Like, it's more like they got the debut album out of the way. They know what they want to do now, especially considering the fact that the debut album was so successful, and it still is to this day. Considering how successful the debut album was, I bet the band was like, this sound really works out for us. So maybe on our next album, we'll do that sound again. And then you get this album. But except this album has less memorable songs compared to the debut album. But then again, the debut album was going to be tough to follow anyway because it's a freaking classic. I wouldn't really say that Van Halen 2 is a classic. I would basically say that this is a great album. It's not a classic. It's a great album. Basically what many people think when they come to Van Halen is the debut album. Other times they'll come to this one, but most of the time it's the debut album because it's just that iconic. But Van Halen 2 is not a bad album by any means. It's a great album. Now let's move on to album number 3. Women and Children First came out in 1980, and this album is, again, it's a step down, but overall, this is still a great album. Here are the dudes on the back. Track listing is up here. I mean, with And the Cradle Will Rock, Romeo Delight, Fools, and In a Simple Rhyme. I mean, with the latter being one of my favorite Van Halen songs of all time. It's just a great song. Great song. Definitely my favorite off the album. Although Romeo Delight is probably a close second, but that's neither here nor there. But overall, this album does have a nice rocking tone to it. This definitely feels like they were trying to expand on the sound of their first 2 albums. But, they do it a lot better on the first 2 albums compared to here, but still, this is a great album nonetheless. And I suggest to any Van Halen fans who hasn't listened to this thing to give it a listen. This is a really enjoyable album. Now, we're going to be talking about album number 4 here. Fair Warning came out in 1981, and for many Van Halen fans, some see it as one of their best albums. Others were a little bit disappointed, especially if they were a fan of the first 3 albums. My dad falls into the latter category. He was not really a big fan of this album when it came out, especially on the somewhat cheesy and generic chorus on the song Unchained. Personally, it's one of my favorite songs on the album. But Unchained is a song where, you kind of sense that David Lee Roth is starting to get full of himself, and as time would go on, he eventually did get full of himself, and he had a big head, and he was just he was just a stain in the band, if you will. But overall, this album is still enjoyable for what it is. I love the artwork on this album. Don't really think it's the best art they've ever done, but it's up there. Mean Street is a great track, so This Is Love is a great song. The aforementioned Unchained. Hear About It Later, One Foot Out the Door, Sunday Afternoon in the Park. This album is really good, even though I think this is the weakest out of the 4 albums that my dad has on vinyl for Van Halen. But overall, it's a really cool and enjoyable record. Now, we're going to go ahead and do a brief run-through of the albums we looked at today. So, first we have the debut album. Actually, no, hold on. We're going to count down what we have here. You could just basically say we're going backwards because, Number 4 is Fair Warning. Number 3 is Women and Children First. Number 2 is Van Halen 2. And number 1 is the debut album. So with that said, that concludes this edition of What's on the Turntable. Thank you so much for watching, my fellow YouTube divers. This is Water Dive 122 signing out, ready to dive into more fun on YouTube. Thanks for watching.